Hello students, I am Satwanti Kapoor from Anthropology Department, University of Delhi. Today I am going to speak on the module Fertility Studies, Concepts and Measures from the paper Demographic Anthropology. Now the learning objective of these modules are 1. The text is an attempt to understand about the concept of fertility, to enrich our knowledge about various common measures of fertility with its advantages and disadvantages, to understand the difference between period and cohort measures of fertility. Next, introduction to demography. Now, to introduce the concept. Now, demography is considered a social science, and its unique character lies in the discipline's emphasis on quantification, analytical models, censuses, and large-scale sample surveys. It remains a social science where the central subject deals with population and population dynamics. It is also the social phenomena emerging from the aggregation of individual life events to a great extent socially determined and with profound social consequences. In the State of Population Theory, 1986, Sheffield and Coleman characterized demography as a discipline with a hard mathematic core and softer surrounding of an explanatory body of theory. The emerging picture of demography is that of an accurate but relatively dull science, strong in accountancy but is considered relatively weak in conceptualization. Now, a one-sided sophistication of data collection and mathematical analysis can never substitute the role of theoretical fundamentals for the formulation of research questions and interpretation of the data. In order to understand the demographic phenomena, theories and conceptual frameworks identifies the causal mechanisms underlying the relations between relevant variables. Wunsch, 1995. Now, demography focuses on three main processes of fertility: mortality and migration, and among these, fertility is perhaps the most abundant and comprehensive theoretical foundation. Now, I'll talk about fertility theory, structure and development. Demography is identified and demarcated by population and population change. The easily quantifiable nature of the major phenomena of interest bolster up the empiricist bias. Various disciplines like economic, sociology, anthropology, history, biology, psychology, and medical sciences have invaded the relative vacuum of theoretical substance, justifying demography as interdisciplinary. This equates the status of demographic theory in general. It equally pertains to that of the theoretical body dealing with fertility. The Malthusian thoughts and population theory. The ideas and observations in regard to fertility and population can be traced back to classic antiquity and ancient Chinese philosopher. These considerations foreshadowed the development of many principles of population growth and development, often addressed the implications for public policy, and remained largely speculative at a low level of generalization. The writings of Malthus at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, usually credited with being the first systematic account of the principles of population change. In his first essay on the principles of populations, published in 1798, the idea that the capacity of human population to reproduce is unlimited, and also proceeded with a geometric ratio, whereas the capacity to produce the means of subsistence is necessarily limited and increases at best in arithmetic fashion. The belief that population and means of subsistence increase with the different ratio means that populations will grow where food production increases, but eventually they face a level where no more people can be sustained and any surplus population dies of starvation. But also other misery such as epidemics, wars, and plagues. He also conceived of a number of preventive checks which operated through people's voluntary act to limit their number of children. Malthus also focused on moral restraint, that is, the sexual abstinence within marriage was considered ineffective because of the overpowering passion between the sexes. Malthus' world view was violently opposed to other means of birth control like abortions and contraceptions. The criticism of Malthusian project has always been often and severe on various ideological grounds. Indeed, it is still the subject of heated debate among scientists and policy makers. One of the main lines of attack concerns of Malthus' assumption of the capacity to increase agricultural output. Another shortcoming of Malthusian reasoning is its failure to distinguish the power of population to increase from their tendency to do so. Many anthropological studies have shown that populations have a large variety of mechanisms at their disposal to keep population size in accordance with the carrying capacity of their environment, ranging from marriage pattern and migration to contraception and child fostering. Despite the recognition that technological innovations keep on pushing up the limits of population growth, the essence of the problem continues to permeate the debate, not only with regards to the food supply, but also in the broader perspective of sustainable development with regard to the exhaustion of non-renewable source of energy. Now, the third is fertility transition. For most of his century, demographers and social scientists have been intrigued by the regularities of demographic change in many different settings all over the world. The apparent processes of demographic transition proceeds in the course of modernization and economic, characterized by high mortality and high fertility, to one where mortality and high fertility are low. The notion of demographic transition gained full momentum only after the seminal publication by Davis 1945 and Norstein 1945. Although the full essence of the contingency between modernization and declining mortality and fertility, as well as the three stages evolution, had already been comprehensively formulated by Thomson in 1929. The classic representation of demographic transition, as for instance sketched by Norstein, it claims that mortality declined in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, which brought material changes in the sense of agricultural innovation, better communication, higher productivity, and improved health conditions. Fertilities ought to be less responsive to such modernizations, and its decline depended largely on the extent of collapse following mortality decline of ideational and normative systems that supported high fertility. The principles of historic demographic transition were thought to be applicable to any contemporary situation in the sense that every nation, region, or population could be located on the evolutionary track of modernization, and the shift from socioeconomic to cultural, ideational, and psychological determinants of fertility decline. Now, there are different stages of demographic transition. Now, the transition model is as follows. In notion often associated with the transition from high to low fertility covers the post-transitional stage, where fertility is under complete control of couples and individuals, where the pre-transitional stage is to large degree left to biologic principles, although constrained by socially constructed boundaries. The analysis of fertility in pre-transitional population has immensely improved since Louis Henry 1953 defined natural fertility as an absence of deliberated control through abortion or contraceptive practice, assuming the fact that the reproductive behavior does not depend on the number of children already born to couple. Now, under the concept of natural fertility, reproduction is determined by a number of biological principles such as age at menarche, fecundity, time required for gestation, intrauterine mortality, and postpartum amenorrhea. The social behavior factors affecting fertility includes marriage pattern, spousal separation, rules for sexual abstinence in certain periods, and duration and intensity of breastfeeding with its effects on the postpartum amenorrhea. The concept of natural fertility has evolved over time, and a culmination point has been achieved in the model of proximate determinant fertility developed by Bongartz, Kinsley Davis, and Judith Blake, provided an eminent contribution with the development of an analytical framework of intermediate determinants of fertility affecting the exposure to intercourse. Bongartz further added to this framework by quantifying the effect of Davis and Blake's intermediate variables and collapsing them into 8 and later 7 proximate determinants of fertility. Any level of fertility in a population can always be accounted to variations in one or more of the following determinants. First, the proportion of women of reproductive age that is married, which is considered as a measure of the proportion exposed to sexual intercourse. 2. Effective use of contraception. 3. Induced abortion. 4. Postpartum infecundity, primarily determined by the duration and intensity of breastfeeding. 5. The frequency of intercourse, including the effect of temporary separation and abstinence practice. Number 6. The onset of permanent sterility, particularly as related to menopause. 7. Spontaneous intrauterine mortality. Next is fertility measurement. Fertility measurement deals about the productive rates that relate numbers of births to number of women. The most widely accepted measure of fertility is the total fertility rate, also called as TFR. It is quite a complex measure but deals within in depth. The different measures which we are going to discuss in this section of the module are as follows. Crude birth rate, GBR, child women ratio, CW ratio, general fertility rate, GFR, age specific fertility rate, ASFR, and total fertility rate, TFR. Parity progression rate, PPR. First is crude birth rate. This measure is a simple ratio of the number of births in a particular period, which is further divided by the total population size. It is defined as the number of live births per thousand estimated mid-year population in a given year, irrespective of age, sex, composition. Mathematically, it is represented as CBR is equal to LBK. Now, the entire formula for your consideration has been shown here. The measure is well suited for construction from vital registrations, providing the numerator and the census data providing the denominator. It can be easily and accurately be calculated in developed countries where well-developed vital registration system and good census data is available. The denominator is a representative of an average population size for the period concerned. However, one shortcoming of this measure is that it takes into account the whole population, but the whole population is not exposed to the childbearing age, and since the crude birth rate takes into account the whole population and not only the women in reproductive age group, therefore it does not give a true idea of the fertility of a population. Still, it is of great importance in demographic studies, especially for planning purposes. Now, next is the crude birth rate. Approximates number of births when limited information is available. Now, disadvantages of this measure, CBR considers the total population in the denominator and treats all ages equally. This is considered as a weakness because the driver of the production of birth is the women in the age group of 15 to 49 of mid-year population. The CBR is confounded by age structure and is hence not considered as an accurate measure of fertility by demographers. Next is child-women ratio. It is defined as the number of young children aged 0 to 4 years per 1000 women of childbearing age, 15 to 44 of mid-year population. Symbolically, the formula stands as, which is given here, you can see it on the screen. Now, its problem as a true measure of fertility is with the numerator, as it misses the children who have died. In a high mortality situation, the fertility estimate will be underdetermined. As a fertility measure, it is rather a rough measure telling about the burden of children in a community. It is also used demographically as a measure of youngness in a population and is also useful for the purpose. It is normally considered as a figure below 1 for low fertility countries and just under 1 for high fertility countries. This may seem a low figure for high fertility countries, but even in these countries, more than 2 children below 5 at any one time is relatively uncommon. Next is general fertility rate or GFR. It is much better measure of fertility than the former two because it takes into account only the women in the childbearing age. It is defined as the number of births per 1000 women of childbearing age. Now you can see the formula on the screen. Everything is explained very nicely. Next is age specific fertility rate, which is considered to be a more precise measure of fertility. It is defined as the number of live births in a year to 1000 women in any specified age group. Mathematically, the formula for ASFR can be represented as ASFR is equal to Bx into K. Now, the entire formula with its different breakup and components has been projected on the screen. Next is total fertility rate, TFR. The total fertility rate is defined as the sum of the age specific fertility rate over the whole range of reproductive ages of a particular period. It can also be interpreted as the average number of children that would be born to married women if she experiences the current fertility pattern throughout her reproductive span. Symbolically, it is represented as it's given on the screen. A better phrase to define total fertility rate would be the average number of children a woman can expect to have given the current levels of fertility. The demographic survey usually inquires the birth history of a woman, full or half. Cohort fertility is the fertility produced by a particular group of women throughout their reproductive life, that is real cohort. If the average number of live birth is 4.2, then it is expressed as a total cohort fertility rate of 4.2. It is often called as the completed family size, which is not to be confused with the period TFR. Cohort fertility is more stable than period fertility but has a disadvantage as it relates to an earlier period of time and is not current. A series of cohort fertility measures plotted like this usually show less variability than a series of period TFRs and accounts a true picture of fertility quantum. Period fertility versus cohort fertility. The given table, you can see, lists the main contrast between the period and cohort approach to measuring fertility. Both are full of their own uses and applications and also gives a different viewpoint of the quantum of fertility. To summarize the module, summary measure is a total fertility rate summary. It measures completed family size. It refers to a synthetic cohort. It reflects the lifetime behavior and intentions of cohort of real women. Parity progression analysis. Complicated parity progression analysis is less complicated. It studies the impact of crisis and short-term intervention It studies the childhood influences on childbearing outcomes. Parity progression ratio, it is the most widely used measure of fertility. Our period measures, age-specific fertility rates and the total fertility rate. These are very useful measures, but they do suffer from one failing. They are not good at detecting real changes in fertility in the short term. In developed countries, one cannot be completely sure for several years that an apparent decline in fertility is not at least partially due to delaying of births until older ages. To fit in with careers and a fashion for establishing households and financial security before childbearing, parity progression ratio are rather a different way of measuring fertility. They are not well appreciated outside of demography. It measures the proportion of women with n children who go on to have n plus 1 children. So PPRs are order specific and comes in sets rather than being single. Summary measures such as the TFR, the conventional symbol for a PPR of a certain birth order is AN. So a set of PPRs would be AO, that is proportion of women with 0 children who have 1 child. Now next you can see on the screen, it's very nicely depicted. Now to summarize the module, fertility is one of the big overarching topics of demography and it deserves serious study. Fertility is the number of live births, not the medical concept of potential to conceive. The crude birth rate is important because of its place in the demographic balancing equation, from which the population growth can be estimated. Age-specific fertility rates are important as they allow to see pattern of fertility, which gives us a good idea of traditional and modern early and late patterns of fertility. The measures like total fertility rate is very important because it is widely used and widely quoted. It is derived directly from ASFRs and is a standardized measure which allows international comparisons. It is by default a period measure, although cohort TFRs are possible. Now, parity progression ratio in their simple form are cohort measures and also provide a different appreciation of fertility without tempo effect. They are particularly sensitive at identifying choice in childbearing. Fertility is an area of demography where many theories exist to explain fertility change, especially focusing on how and why fertility decline commences. This is an interesting area, but this module focuses on the technical assessment of fertility and the key measures that demographers must understand and know how to calculate and interpret. I hope after listening to this module and after going through the module on the screen, you will be able to grasp different measures of fertility. Thank you.